Although this session is titled Regulatory Heavyweights, we're going to take a little bit of a lighter weight approach to this. We certainly don't want to overwhelm you with the regulatory environment because we know that a lot of folks in the audience may not have a lot of background in the regulated telecommunications and broadband space. So we'll try to keep it as high level as we possibly can. We also know that it's lunchtime here, so we don't want to overwhelm you or potentially nauseate you with all the details that we might have to provide here. So before we get started, we're going to talk about a variety of things and certainly introduce my two colleagues here in just a moment who truly are a couple of regulatory heavyweights in the industry. We want to get their insight related to regulation, things like partnerships and collaboration and how the industry associations help with all of those different things. So just real quick from an introductory perspective, my name's Chad Duval. I'm a partner at Moss Adams. I know you all had expected and the agenda said that Doug Kitch was going to be up here moderating. And for those of you who know Doug Kitch, know he's got a little bit of stage fright. And so he asked me to come up here in his stead and work through this presentation with Josh and Derrick. So on that note, I'll ask Josh Seidemann and Derrick Owens to do brief introductions of themselves before we officially kick things off here. Josh?
Chad, thanks very much. I'd actually wanted to introduce Derrick, and then I wanted Derrick to introduce me, but it's okay. I know myself a little bit better. I'm Josh Seidemann, VP of Policy and Industry Innovation for NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. We represent about 850 small, locally operated rural broadband providers throughout the United States. And I think at last count, we had about 120 who are serving tribal areas, including some that are tribally owned.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Derrick Owens. I'm Senior Vice President of Government and Industry Affairs for WTA. We have about 370 small rural telco members who are broadband providers across the country. They are small family-owned, privately owned, some cooperatives, several tribally owned companies as well. So we're looking forward to participating in this session with you all today.
Great, thanks guys. And the way we're going to approach this is I've got a series of slides here. Again, nothing terribly deep. That I'll give a high-level overview of sort of the topics on each of those slides. And then I'm going to ask Derrick and Josh a series of questions to provide some additional context as to how they approach the regulatory environment and collaboration and partnerships within the industry from an association perspective. So starting out here, just a little bit of background on the political and regulatory landscape in Washington, D.C. And from a regulatory perspective, we know that the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, is the regulatory agency that, from a federal perspective, regulates telecommunications and broadband services. So just a little bit of background on how the FCC sort of works and is established. So first of all, you've got 5 FCC commissioners that are nominated by the president. And then those nominees are approved by Congress through the Senate. The president nominates who the chairperson is of the FCC. And the president also gets to have a 3-2 majority on the FCC. So at any given time, you've typically got 5 commissioners. 3 will be in the political party of the president. The other 2 will be in the minority. As I mentioned before, commissioners are confirmed by the Senate, and the FCC is directly responsible to Congress. They actually are overseen by a committee called the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. And interestingly, even though the president nominates and selects the chairman of the FCC or chairperson of the FCC, they are independent of the executive branch. So they answer to Congress, not to the president. So on that note, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and ask a few questions of our esteemed panelists here. So you guys both live and work in D.C. I summarized the landscape in D.C. at a very high level. So I was going to say in 30 seconds or less, but let's call it a minute or so. how would you describe the relationship between the FCC, Congress, and the White House? And we'll start with Josh on this one.
So I think that Chad's slide does an excellent job of summarizing how all these different offices work together. And it's this very interesting dynamic because the president gets to nominate the commissioners and he gets to select the chairman of the FCC. But it has to be approved by the Senate. It has to go through a Senate confirmation hearing, much like a judicial appointment. And ultimately, the Federal Communications Commission is an independent agency, so it's not a member of the president's cabinet. Because Congress effectively controls the purse strings of the FCC, it's not unusual for Congress to call FCC commissioners up to the Hill for hearings, to ask them questions, to push them, to express their unhappiness from time to time. And that happens much more frequently when Congress is controlled by a party that's not the president's own party. So that's not infrequent. It's not unusual, but it does provide, I think, a window of opportunity for the trade associations because it means that we can, in addition to lobbying the FCC for our positions and policies that are favorable to the community, we can also go up to Capitol Hill and hope to influence members of Congress, and then they can lean on the Federal Communications Commission and lean on the commissioners as well to affect beneficial change for the industry.
Great. Thanks, Josh. And Derrick, what do you have to add to that?
From a structural standpoint, not much more. But just to give a little bit more context, so the Democrats control the Senate by a very, very slim margin. And in the House, that's controlled by the Republicans. And so the relationship between the FCC and the Senate is not as, in my mind, as contentious as it probably could be. On the House side, you're going to see a lot more oversight of the FCC coming up. There's obviously a lot of money, the various programs that the FCC administers, and over the last number of years, our agencies have been talking to congressional offices about some of the changes and we would like to see the FCC make, but those things haven't sort of happened. And so there's going to be this dynamic, a really big give and take this year, in my mind, of the FCC being called to Congress to testify on a number of issues. Oversight is what Congress is supposed to do. And so I think you're going to see a lot of oversight coming out of Congress toward the FCC. With respect to the White House, as Josh mentioned, the FCC is an independent agency. During my time at NTIA, we were trying to work on a number of things, and we were always reminded, well, we're an independent agency, the FCC would say. And so the White House, we would have to basically work to structure things as, saying we would highly advise that you do certain things so you didn't be, sort of break that independent streak. But, the White House talks to the FCC quite a bit.
Yeah, good points. And it sounds like you're saying that there may be a little bit of partisan politics going on, at least with the split houses there. So, all right. Well, we'll continue moving on. I did want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the differences between an ILEC or an incumbent local exchange carrier and an ISP or an internet service provider. And most people in this room are probably far more familiar with the concept of an ISP versus an ILEC. So ILECs tend to be far more regulated than ISPs are. So a lot of the efforts that we all go through start with that mindset of the heavy regulation that comes into being an incumbent local exchange carrier. So just a couple of differences real quick to sort of set them apart is first, an ILEC is a sort of a highly regulated provider of voice and broadband services. So the voice network they build, that's sort of the legacy requirement of being an ILEC is that you have to provide that voice service on a universal service basis. You have to make voice service available to everyone out there. But over time, as broadband technologies have advanced, you have essentially a dual use network. When you deploy that fiber or fixed wireless or whatever the case may be, you've got that connection to the end user customer that you can then utilize to provide both voice and broadband services. And again, just that voice side of the network tends to be fairly highly regulated. Do we have a question? Okay, so an ILEC, again, is an incumbent local exchange carrier, and an ISP is an internet service provider. So I apologize if I didn't define those acronyms. And then, so from an internet service provider perspective, we'll say that that's an ISP is traditionally providing or primarily providing broadband services. They're very lightly regulated and primarily by the FCC. There have been some states and tribal authorities that are essentially claiming regulatory jurisdiction over broadband services. A little bit of battle back and forth with the FCC on that topic. But again, we're utilizing the same network to connect to our end user customers and providing both voice and broadband over that same network. So, Derrick and Josh, I touched on the regulatory differences between ILECs and ISPs, again, at a very high level there. But how do you advocate differently for ILECs and ISPs based on these differences, if at all? So we'll go ahead and start with, I thought I was going to say Derrick. Let's go ahead and start with Derrick, and then we'll go to Josh. So we go back and forth here.
Thanks, Chad. So WTA, our membership is primarily, well, not primarily, it is all ILECs. And so our advocacy really is focused on the ILECs themselves. Obviously, the ILECs may have an ISP subsidiary, but it's really focusing in on making sure that the ILEC responsibilities that those companies, what those requirements are that they have, we try to get those across to the policymakers at the FCC as well as up on Capitol Hill. You touched on all of the issues of regulation, and clearly our companies are highly regulated, and there's a lot that goes into that. And that's sort of how we look at things from a regulatory standpoint of the ILEC perspective, not necessarily just the ISP side, since most of the companies are, their ISPs may be a subsidiary of the actual company itself.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that Derrick makes there is that most companies, if not all companies that are ILECs, are also ISPs. They're in that, not only the voice business, but also in the broadband business. And so when we talk about regulation of ILECs or the operation of ILECs, it tends to be sort of both sides of the coin. So Josh, what comments do you have there?
So like the membership of WTA, NTCA's membership is primarily, and again with some exceptions, primarily these ILEC companies. And there are two major, I would say, canons of legal categories into which these companies can fall. So when we talk about the ILECs, we talk about them being regulated under what we call Title II. And that is just, as Chad's slide reflects, very heavy, very detailed regulation concerning many aspects of their operations. And they're referred to as common carriers. So no different than railroads, than electric companies, or any other business that has to accept everyone who comes to them and wants service. ISPs, on the other hand, are regulated under a much lighter form of regulation under Title I of the law. So there's not a ton of regulation. It's really there just in case they either happen to go off the rails or for specific aspects of their business that may require government intervention. Where we fall out on the advocacy, though, is we want to make sure that the regulation of the ISP remains that light touch regulation. There's a famous court case involving AT&T, and the court said that if you have a single unified company, even if it has common carrier, even if it has ILEC operations, anything that it does on the ISP side of the house is not going to be regulated like an ILEC. It will just be regulated very lightly as an ISP. Where we have seen the potential hazard of a legal shift was in 2015 in the net neutrality proceeding. And that could have introduced all sorts of regulations on the ISP side of the house, including potential rate regulation, privacy regulation, other requirements as well. The FCC eventually reversed itself, and the internet service provider, that ISP side of the house, is still only under this lightly regulated Title I. So our advocacy is really primarily focused, in addition, again, to making sure that we have the resources necessary to build the networks, making sure that the ISP side remains under a light touch regulation.
Great, thanks, guys. This next topic that I wanted to talk a little bit about is not really strictly a regulatory topic, but I did want to leverage the vast experience of the two gentlemen on the stage here to discuss how partnerships can prove very beneficial to tribal broadband providers. So again, I'll just touch on a couple of high points, and then we'll talk to the two gentlemen here for a few minutes here. So just looking at tribal partnerships, and I think this has been sort of a theme throughout the entire conference. We've got all of these tremendous vendors out in the halls here and in the sides of the rooms here, serving as partners to tribal broadband providers, really helping you to figure out how do we best get into the broadband business. What are some of the best approaches and best practices in building networks and providing services to our customers that are sorely lacking today? And so, some of the things that you may need help with, may need partnerships to ensure that you're really taking into consideration things along assessment of your business and whether it's a feasible thing to do to deploy a broadband network and provide services to your customers. Looking at financing, how do we go about financing our networks here? We heard earlier today from some folks from NTIA, and that's been a theme throughout. And so we want to be looking at what financing is out there and available to deploy these networks and continue. I think a theme throughout has been sustainability, making sure that those networks are sustainable over time. How do we go about deploying those networks? And again, we've got tremendous vendors throughout the hallways here talking to us about the different types of equipment that they've got to help us in the deployment of those networks. How do we go about operating and maintaining our networks? Who's out there to help us with that, with vast experience in the industry? And then how do we go about looking at growing and expanding our operations to make sure that we're successful over time? So just some thoughts on advantages of those strategic partnerships, the types of, or the situations in which you can look for folks to partner with and help you be successful going forward. So I'll circle back to the two gentlemen over here. And so, Derrick, WTA works with a lot of broadband providers of various shapes and sizes. What opportunities do you see for partnerships between tribes and existing broadband providers or others looking to get into the space or those with ready access to capital?
Yeah, Chad, thanks for that question. I think there's a great opportunity for partnerships, quite honestly. It really focuses, in my mind, beginning with engagement, both on the tribal side, but on the incumbent side, if you're providing service in an area. So I do think there's opportunities available, but in my mind, it begins with engagement first, talking through those things, because if you're a new entrant coming into the market, you're not going to know everything. But if there's an ILEC in the area who you might be able to partner with from a business standpoint, talk about sustainability, there's a host of, you talked on the last slide about all the regulatory requirements that you sort of fall under if you become an ILEC or the ISP. Even though it's lightly regulated, there's still a number of things that you would have to do as a provider that you may not know, but partnering with, an incumbent could be a way in which you actually learn how to operate the networks that you're building, but also partner and defer some of the costs associated with those build outs as well. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity. From our association standpoint, we have a tribal affairs committee where we talk through a lot of these issues. And, there are companies who are talking to one another who may not have been talking to one another before, but it's like, well, this is maybe an opportunity for us to work together. But again, it's going to start with, in my mind, engaging both sides and having a discussion among them.
Great. Thanks, Derrick. And Josh, I understand that you've got a good example of successful partnership between an existing broadband provider and various tribal entities. Can you give us a high-level overview of that example?
Sure. So this This profile is actually written up in some resources that NTCA has on its website, and I'll give you the website address now, and then I'll say it again when I'm done so you can write it down. But it's ntca.org/smart. The situation, or the I guess the partnership that Chad is referring to, is we have a regular rural telephone company in Kansas, and it was working with a small tribe in the northeast part of the state. It's a small tribe. They've got about 100 members. They have a casino. They have a healthcare facility, a few businesses. About 10 years ago, they applied for a federal grant to put fiber in to their community. They had, until that point, been relying on fixed wireless. Their original thought was that they were going to own, operate, manage the network. As they got more deeply into it, they contacted the other communications provider and figured out what kind of an arrangement can we work out with you. As a sovereign nation, they wanted to retain ownership of the network, but they executed a management agreement with the rural telco. So the rural telco manages the operation, the maintenance, the customer-facing operations of the network. The tribe owns the network, and the relationship turned out to be good enough that they have since applied for several other federal grants together, and they're undertaking other ventures, including the creation of a trade school to teach students the telecom trades, and some other initiatives as well. So it's ntca.org/smart. And if you scroll down, you'll see a link that will take you to a paper that offers about 20 questions that people should ask each other when they're thinking about these sorts of partnerships, and then has some case studies as well.
Yeah, no, I think both Josh and Derrick have given some really good examples here. And I think it's really important to understand that there are other providers out there who have been down this path before, the path that either you're starting down or maybe thinking about starting down. And there's a lot of great opportunities out there for, to get some resources, to get some of that experience working in your favor through utilizing some partnerships. All right. Wanted to talk about a little bit of collaboration among the associations here. And a term that I heard earlier this week, and I'm going to apologize in advance to whoever told me about it because I've forgotten who it was already. But I heard someone use the term co-opetition. I just love that term because you look at the two gentlemen up on the stage here representing NTCA and WTA respectively, and they compete for membership and sponsorships and all these different things. And yet they sit up here on the stage and they work collaboratively together to the common good of, the NTTA group and the folks in attendance here. But the same is also true in Washington, D.C. They don't, fight against each other. They work together. They collaborate in the best interest of the industry. And, as different associations, and they introduced themselves and their associations earlier, but they do have varying memberships. Not everyone's a member of both associations. They come from very different roots. NTCA, that originally was the National Telecommunications Cooperative Association and represented only cooperatives. That's different today, but their roots are in the cooperative environment. Whereas WTA was always more commercial providers, those who, family-owned or stock-owned companies. They have distinct specialties and resources. And this is just my own viewpoint of it, and certainly not intending any offense here. But WTA is very small and fairly nimble in terms of the staff that they have. They've got a relatively low number of employees, but they do a lot of really good, positive things with those few folks that they have. Whereas NTCA is far larger from an organizational perspective and maybe are able to get into a variety of different issues that maybe WTA doesn't always focus on as well. So they have distinct specialties and resources, but they come together to mesh really, really well. They also have diverse contacts and relationships. Everyone at these different associations comes from different backgrounds. They meet different people. And so they can bring that together to make sure we always know who we should be talking to or where we have an inside track on something. But at the end of the day, they both have the same common goal, and that's broadband for all. So with that in mind, I'm going to shift to a couple more questions here. So First, I'll start with Josh on this one. How do you see the varying roles of the trade associations, including NTTA, including a lot of the folks in this room, triangulating to best advocate for rural broadband providers, and specifically tribal issues in this space?
So I think that your use of the word triangulating is perfect. And I think that describes how we work together. There's an old saying that if you've seen one rural area, you have seen one rural area. And I think, based on the experience I've had working with Godfrey and some of the other tribal members, that the same thing can be said about the tribal interests. When you've seen one tribe, you've seen one tribe. Everyone has a unique community dynamic, unique needs. But I think that overriding all of those are the common thread of ensuring that the broadband resources are there for everyone. In terms of what we bring to the table, a lot of my work focuses on the FCC nuts and bolts, but I also have, because I have the luxury of looking things at how broadband is used for agriculture and telehealth and education to support economic development. So those are specific things that I can bring to the table that can help enhance, I hope, and bolster the other legislative initiatives and the regulatory initiatives of the other associations.
Derrick, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say, the benefit of trade associations is it allows you as an individual entity to have a voice with a larger group going in to advocate, to make statements of policy, to share stories, and we'll talk a little bit about more about that soon. But it does allow you to sort of tackle an issue from multiple angles and provide a lot of information to the folks who you're trying to actually advocate a position to. So I would say it's, triangulation is a good term. Our associations, we differ on some things, but we're constant on a number of things. And when we go in, I think from the standpoint of having more voices at the table and more entities, it's better than having one group talk about a particular issue and those folks that you're advocating to say, okay, this is just one group. But if you have 3 or 4 of them, then it's like, okay, we're bringing all of that collective knowledge together and everybody's working together. You're not going to agree on everything all of the time, but when you do agree and you bring those forces together and show that, I think it resonates with folks.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. And I don't want to speak on behalf of NTTA here, but I'll certainly try, and Godfrey can correct me where I misstep. But, as both of these associations vary a little bit in their focus and the things that they do best, NTTA really steps in there and says, hey, we're here on behalf of, broadband on tribal lands. And so that's the primary focus of NTTA. Both of these associations represent a very diverse group of companies, and not that there's not diversity within NTTA, but the real focus there is what's best to get broadband to tribal lands across the country. And so again, that triangulation, all 3 associations coming together to do some really powerful things before the FCC and also before Congress. So Derrick, what should companies attending the Tribal Broadband Summit be doing from an advocacy perspective before both the FCC and Congress? So how should they be looking at company-specific advocacy versus trade association advocacy?
Yeah, great question, Chad. Thank you. So just a little bit of background on me and how I sort of think about advocacy. I used to work on Capitol Hill for 7 years. I worked for a member of Congress. And it was always a great opportunity when folks from the district came in to talk to my boss, because he knew those constituents. He knew the areas in which they wanted to focus. And so that was always important. And one of the things he always said was, tell your story. And when you can tell your story, that resonates with whether it's your member of Congress or your senator. Because believe it or not, folks, members of Congress actually talk to one another. And when they can share a story from their district with someone else from another state, another part of the country, region, and they find that, wow, there's actually a common message, a common thread, a common issue that we need to resolve, that allows them to be able to go to their colleagues and say, let's work on this because this is important. I mean, we're working on some broadband tax legislation right now, and it's very bipartisan. It's bicameral, so it's both in the House and the Senate. And it's because these members of Congress have heard from folks that if they get these BEAD dollars and some of the other grant dollars that have come out through COVID over the last couple of years, that they're potentially they are taxable. And so now there's a group saying, wait a second, that wasn't our intent. And it's because we had our members going in and talking about this, saying, why should we be giving back 20% or so of the grant dollars that we're going to be getting when you want broadband out there? And so both Republicans and Democrats say, yes, this makes sense. And that's where the advocacy comes in, where you bring people in talking, telling their stories, and it allows for it to resonate both with your member of Congress who then advocates for other folks as well. So I would say, Chad, it really starts right at that point. Tell your story, work with our groups just as we're working with you all through NTTA to tell that story, because that's when you have the most effect.
Great. Josh, anything to add?
2 words: numbers and narrative. It's exactly like Derrick said. It's that narrative. It's the story of what goes on in your community that resonates with members of Congress and with policymakers and makes it stick. NTC, we have a program called Smart Communities, and the program is intended to not so much drive the deployment of broadband. We have the advocacy side of the house for that, but this program, Smart Communities, which has Smart Rural Community and Smart Tribal Community extensions, is intended to encourage using broadband to support agriculture and education and healthcare and economic development. And what we've done in this program is we've published a number of papers, and we demonstrate, we do the research, we have the data that demonstrates what is the economic benefit of deploying telehealth, what are the productivity yields you get from using broadband from agriculture, how does broadband play a role in economic development. But then with those numbers, we pair stories from what our members have done, and those include the company in Kansas that worked with the small tribe in the northeast corner of its state. This is the framework, and then by the way, this is how the companies built the house. So that numbers and narrative approach, we'll tell the numbers, but we need your help in coming to Washington to help frame out the narrative and make that story stick with policymakers.
Great. Let's keep moving here. Didn't want to pass on this opportunity to talk a little bit more about the benefits of trade associations. That includes NTTA, NTCA, and WTA, and potentially others. I don't want to say we're lobbying for your membership here, but I think it's very powerful what these associations can do. I mean, look around this room at what NTTA has pulled together. That's a very powerful thing. And these associations can certainly use your membership to help produce these benefits for your companies as well as the industries. So I'll just ask a couple quick questions and then we'll wrap up here before long. Derrick, can you provide a brief overview of the regulatory and legislative environment for broadband? It seems like a repeat question. I don't know if I've asked that before.
Yeah, we sort of did, but it goes back to just where we were talking about, ILECs are highly regulated, ISPs aren't, Title I, Title II regulation. It's,
Maybe a better question is the second one that I've had that I'll start with Josh and then we'll come back to Derrick. So Josh, what role do the various trade associations play in the regulatory and legislative environment? Can you give a little bit more context of what you all are doing in that environment?
Yeah. So, operationally, I'll just describe from the NTCA perspective, but I think WTA, you operate the same way. You've got a side of the house that's working with the FCC and working with policymakers and filing papers and meeting with the FCC staff to make sure that the regulations that come out of the FCC are favorable or beneficial or not overly burdensome to the industry. At the same time, we have a team that's dispatched to Capitol Hill and works with the legislators and brings our members into the district. And putting that all together, I just want to respond to something that Derrick said before. We're together on a lot of issues. We might not be together on all the issues, But at least when we present those pathways to Congress and to the FCC, even if they find a middle ground, it's something that we can live with. And we always say that the solution that we propose is better than the solution that the regulators will propose themselves for us. We know the community, we know the business, and it's important to have your participation and enable us to present that strength in numbers to the policymakers.
And I would add sometimes too, Chad, sometimes you have to play good cop, bad cop to get to the middle where you think you need to be and where it's good public policy. And I think, we all look at those things, not that that's the end goal. I mean, the main objective, you're the good cop, I'm the bad cop. But sometimes you have to present scenarios so that the outcome that you truly want, you work toward the middle to get it. And I think that's sort of sometimes how we have to operate in order to get what we need to have the companies move forward on broadband deployment.
I'm not sure whether Derrick was calling me the bad cop here.
I was just going to ask, who's the good cop, bad cop here?
I think I'm the bad cop.
All right. So I think we've sort of come to the end of the prepared comments and questions that we had. I wanted to see, and Godfrey, I don't want to overstay our welcome, so please give me the heave-ho when you need to. But wanted to check and see if we do have any questions from the audience. Truly two heavyweights in the industry here, and I'm just tagging along as sort of their follow behind. So if there's anything that we can answer now or after our session here, we're certainly happy to do that.
Go ahead.
So the question was earlier I mentioned that there's 5 slots on the FCCs as commissioners, and right now we've only got 4 slots full. The 5th slot has been empty for I guess almost 2 years at this point. Gigi Sohn, a well-known sort of Democratic consumer advocate, had been nominated and was sitting there waiting and had gone through a couple of confirmation hearings and recently withdrew her nomination, I guess, just because it had sort of become a mudslinging sort of situation. And so she backed out. And so now the FCC's got to go back, or the president's got to go back to the drawing board and find another nominee. So the question was, do we know or any insight as to who that may be? I don't have a lot of good insight in that, but I've got a sense that one of these gentlemen does. I'm going to start with Derrick and see if you have any thoughts on who might be a reasonable nominee here.
Well, I think the top candidate right now might be Ana Gomez, who used to work at NTIA, a known entity, not someone who, carries sort of the reputation that Gigi carried, unfortunately. Or I think she's probably going to be the likely nominee and moving through the process right now. If not, it could be another person who was also at NTIA at one point. So I suspect we will probably know something in the next month or so. And then going through the confirmation process definitely won't take as long, but could possibly have the 5th commissioner in my mind before summer is out, quite honestly.
Josh, anything to add?
Like Derrick said, there's a couple of names circulating. Ana Gomez, Smitty Smith. I've got to believe that the White House might have taken a lesson from the past 18 months and will ensure that their next nominee, again, all the nominees are going to be partisan to one side or the other. But if you get someone who's not far off to one edge, you've got a better chance of getting them through. And once they get that majority commission seated, then the chairwoman, Jessica Rosenworcel, can maybe start moving some of the more difficult dockets forward, and we can see some movement.
Great. Thanks. Other questions? All right. I'm not seeing any. So just a couple of things here in closing. First, thank you for allowing us to interrupt your peaceful lunch and share our thoughts on regulation and how partnerships, collaboration, and trade associations can help you successfully navigate the regulatory environment. Contact information, Excuse me. Contact information is up here on this slide. Also, just something that we wanted to offer the three of us to NTTA or other attendees here. If you are interested in a deeper dive into the regulatory environment, we'd be happy to do that at another time. We wanted to keep things very high level today, but would be happy to do another session through NTTA or elsewhere to really give you a bit of a deeper dive into that regulatory environment in maybe a setting that's a little bit more conducive to it. So want to thank you all for your attention this afternoon. Hopefully this was beneficial to you all, and really want to thank Godfrey and all of NTTA. Great event. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I kind of got a question for you guys before you guys leave. One of the things that I was thinking of when I brought these guys in, hey, I'm fighting the fight by myself for NTTA. I've got a few of the guys coming with me all the time, but I mean, everybody sees my face over there in DC quite a bit. What makes that easier for me is when I join each of these associations to be able to help me fight that fight. WTA does a great job. NTCA does a great job, but they have all the member companies in the United States that belong to either one or both of them together. So if we want a voice and we need help with an issue, we've got to talk to these guys to help us along. Their voice carries a lot of weight in DC, along with ours, but all together. You saw that triad. I really like that. Whoever made that triad with NTCA, NTTA, and WTA. I mean, what cooler thing can you have when you go into the Hill and you got all these people coming in and they can say, well, we're backing all the, we have a voice for 1,000 telcos, and another one says we're the voice for 700. But for NTTA to come in right now, all I can say is 12 to 14. But I want to start saying, hey, we're building broadband companies, and we are the voice of 200 tribal nations that have built companies across the United States. That's where we get all together and get a bigger voice in DC. This is going to be coming. You're going to have to rely on this at some point in time. When you transition from one company to another, when you change from ISP to ETC to an ILEC, there's a path there. It might not happen right now, but you guys are starting to learn this whole effect of what's going on right now. It's brand new. And we got some $3 billion that's going to be thrown at any country. There's going to be some companies built, but we got to make sure that we have our voice heard. When we talked about sustainability earlier, when I talked to the states about that, they're willing to look at help. But if we have to do it at the FCC level, I mean, who do we go to help us? And we will fight the fight. NTTA will do that. But now I need help from WTA and NTCA, especially in that area. And that's why Moss Adams is there to help us. They've been helping us advocate. They've been writing our different opinions, and we provide those services. So I'd like to see if we can form some kind of collaboration, and we have that triad. I mean, I like that. So I like to see that as a stamp to where we're working with the association, say, hey, we're an alliance. Don't mess with us. We're coming in. We're coming to get you guys, and we're going to change these rules that you guys have made. I want any country to be aware of that. So this is happening and starting right now. And like I said, there's going to be a lot of new tribal companies. We need a voice. So I like to say, you know, guys, how do you guys feel about that? I know there's some naysayers in each company or each association, but the only way to get over that is tribal engagement. How can we work together to be able to get to know each other?
Right.
Sometimes two bullies on a block, you know, once they get to know each other, we'll throw a couple of fists, they become the best friends forever. So it might become to that. So what do you guys have to say about that?
Well, Godfrey, first of all, what you've been doing over the last number of years is very impressive. It's very difficult to go from nothing to starting an association and now getting to this point where you have several hundred members, several hundred people here, probably 100 or so vendors outside. So kudos to you and the staff, the volunteer staff who have helped to make this happen. You come to DC with a crew, and I think, I always try to make time to make sure that we have those conversations, that we engage with one another, because I'm not going to hear everything that you're obviously hearing working with the NTTA folks. So I do think it is important that we continue the collaboration, that, we're here to help in whatever way we can. Like you say, we may not always agree on everything, but I think we'll agree on probably 75% of what we're discussing. And ultimately, the objective is to get broadband to everybody. Obviously, there's processes that we have to go through and how we come to policy decisions, but you can't reach those policy decisions if you're not talking to one another. And so I appreciate, again, what you've been able to do in continuing to keep those lines of communications open, because I think it is important and it's been effective.
That's one of the great things that you just said right now about that policy group. I get in on those calls. I zoom in and I make my voice heard from being Miscula Apache Telecom as a member of WTA. They're working about caps, or we're looking at different issues. I always test the temperature of certain things. How do you guys feel about tribes getting ETCs? How far would you go to be able to get us some help on the Hill and try to make this happen? Because it's tough to get an ETC nowadays. I mean, there's so many rules governing that right now. It's not easy. I did it back in 1999, 2000. And actually, Ana Gomez was the one that helped write my ETC. I mean, this is a great person. So as you know about more people in DC, these are the people that are going to help you, and we can change things. And I've been doing it for a while, but man, I sure would like to have more people behind me to get this done. And like I said, NTTA 2.0 is coming down the road. All these young managers for a lot of the small companies, they're going to be coming up. You're not going to see me here no more. You're going to have more of these younger guys coming in. Duncan, Michael, some of these guys. I'm going to be leaning on them to help guide us into the next phase of everything else. So I want to make sure that we have a relationship with the organization. And you saw that triangle of support. These guys, we're all going to be there to help you. Again, we're not going to agree on everything, but I do want to move the goalposts sometimes left or right, just to be able to get the things that we need. Josh?
I was going to say that if we all put on blindfolds and we removed the labels and we talked about communities that are not big towns, but they're small communities that need broadband to enable better access to telehealth, education, jobs, suddenly the issues that we all have are very common. And what is necessary for a tribal region and Indian country is the same what's necessary for a rural community. And I think that if we can get together and tell that common story in Capitol Hill and in the halls of the FCC, we advance those goalposts for all of us. We get that ball moving forward. And if there's places where we disagree, where maybe the needle has to be this way or that way, we'll get through it. We'll manage it. But ultimately, we're all going to improve the situation for all of us.
Well, I want to invite you back at our fall conference. I really like to form some kind of a MOU where we're all working together as associations and to be able to back each other. I'd like to see if we can build something like that triangle. And I'm so appreciative of Chad and Moss Adams and all the group there for us to rely on. They write a lot of our wording that we want to compete in this nature, to be able to provide regulatory policy decisions. They've done that, and I appreciate you guys doing that and your continued support for Indian country. I mean, why am I going to be there trying to write this stuff? But these guys all work there, so I need somebody to do that. So Moss Adams is doing that for us, and they've been a partner with NTTA many a years. So I appreciate, like Doug and Rob, you guys have been excellent. So as we go forward, thank you guys. And I like I said, I want to come back and hopefully we get a bigger alliance, maybe an MOU or something, we're all signing on and we're working together for the better good of Indian country. Thank you.
Thank you.